For years, China has been playing a very careful game. Publicly neutral, privately useful, telling the West it wants peace while quietly making sure Russia has everything it needs to keep fighting. That game just ended. Hidden inside shipping manifests, buried inside captured Russian weapons, and tracked across thousands of satellite images, Western intelligence agencies have assembled a dossier so damning that Beijing cannot spin its way out of it. China has been secretly arming Russia, and the proof is now impossible to ignore. But here's the part that nobody in Moscow or Beijing saw coming. China's secret operation has not saved Russia. It has handed Ukraine and the West the single most powerful weapon they have ever had. Ironclad, documented, undeniable proof. And what happens next is going to make the last 4 years of this war look like a warm-up act. The story does not begin in a war room in Brussels or classified briefing in Langley. It begins on a battlefield in eastern Ukraine where engineers from Ukraine's weapons analysis units have spent 2 years doing something that no military in modern history has ever had the opportunity to do at this scale, systematically dismantling Russia's weapons and reading them like forensic evidence. Every Shahed drone that Ukraine shoots down, every Russian missile that fails to detonate, every artillery shell casing collected from the craters it leaves behind. Ukraine's engineers take these apart, component by component, and they catalog what they find. Manufacturers, part numbers, countries of origin. And for the better part of the last 18 months, one name has been appearing with increasing frequency inside the guts of Russia's most used weapons: China. That battlefield intelligence has been flowing directly into a joint Western intelligence effort involving the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and several other NATO partners. The Kyiv School of Economics has been cross-referencing it with trade data, shipping records, and customs declarations. And in early 2026, the result of all of that work landed on the desks of NATO defense ministers in the form of a joint intelligence assessment that confirmed what analysts had long suspected but could never definitively prove. China is not neutral. China has not been neutral. And the evidence trail, stretching from Chinese factories to Russian weapons on Ukrainian battlefields, is now long enough, detailed enough, and verified enough that Beijing has no credible response to it. None. Let's be specific. Because the details are what make this so damning and so dangerous for China. Inside the Shahed 136 drone, Russia's most widely deployed long-range attack weapon, the one it fires in swarms of hundreds at Ukrainian cities, researchers have found Chinese-manufactured MEMS gyroscopes. These are micro-electromechanical systems guidance components. Without them, a Shahed drone cannot navigate. It cannot find its target. It is a chunk of foam and metal that falls out of the sky. With them, it is a precision weapon that can fly 2,000 kilometers and hit a specific building. Russia cannot manufacture these components domestically. Western sanctions have cut off every other supply route. And yet, Russia's Shahed production has not only continued, it has accelerated. The only explanation that fits the evidence is China. Then there are the artillery shells. Russia has been firing artillery at a rate that staggers military analysts, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 rounds per day at peak periods. Maintaining that rate of fire requires enormous quantities of propellant chemicals. After Western sanctions gutted Russia's access to Western chemical suppliers, its propellant production should have cratered. It did not. What the weapons analysis teams found inside captured Russian artillery shells are propellant compound signatures consistent with Chinese industrial chemical production. Not similar to, consistent with. These are traceable, and they have been traced. And then there is the manufacturing infrastructure. Russia's defense industry requires precision machine tools, computer-controlled equipment that shapes, mills, and finishes the metal components of everything from tank gun barrels to missile casings. After 2022, Russia's access to Western machine tools was severed entirely. What happened next should not have been possible. Russian defense factories kept producing. The Kyiv School of Economics cross-referenced this with export data from China's own customs authority. Between 2022 and 2025, Chinese machine tool exports to Russia increased by over 400%. These are not kitchen appliances being accidentally rerouted. These are precision industrial systems that have one primary application inside Russia's current economy: making weapons. Let that sink in. Guidance chips for drones, propellant chemicals for artillery shells, the very machine tools used to manufacture the weapons Russia fires into Ukrainian apartment buildings. All of it sourced from China. All of it now documented. And all of it flowing through a network of shell companies in the UAE, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Hong Kong, set up specifically to disguise the origin of the transactions and insulate Chinese state-linked manufacturers from direct accountability. China did not stumble into this. It was engineered, deliberately, systematically. And now the West knows exactly how. Here is where Beijing's strategy stops looking clever and starts looking catastrophically short-sighted. Because the financial logic that China used to justify this operation does not survive contact with the numbers. Let's do the math. According to US Treasury and European Union sanctions enforcement data, Russia has spent approximately $300 billion prosecuting its war in Ukraine since February 2022. Analysts at the Kyiv School of Economics estimate that between $15 billion and $20 billion of that total has flowed toward acquiring the dual-use components and materials that China has been providing, funneled through intermediaries, obscured in customs filings, and laundered through third-country shell companies. Call it $17, $5 billion as our midpoint figure. Now here is the number that should be keeping officials in Beijing awake at night. According to 2025 U.S. Census Bureau trade data, China's total annual exports to the United States alone amount to $427 billion per year. Its broader trade relationship with the G7, the United States, the European Union combined, the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, is worth well over $1, $2 trillion annually. China has been risking a $1, $2 trillion trading relationship to collect $17, $5 billion from a country that is visibly, measurably, mathematically losing a war. That is not a trade deal. That is a $1, $2 trillion gamble placed on a horse that is already limping toward the finish line, and the gamble has already begun to fail. In February 2026, the United States Treasury Department added 14 Chinese entities to its sanctions list specifically for providing materials used in Russian weapons production. That was the opening move in what intelligence officials describe as a much larger second wave of designations currently in preparation. Each designation cuts the named company off from the US dollar payment system, meaning they cannot settle international transactions, cannot access US correspondent banks, and effectively cannot operate in the global economy. For the $17 $5 billion that China's manufacturers have earned arming Russia, they are now watching the foundation of their access to global markets begin to crack. Advantage: Ukraine, and the West, by a margin so large it almost defies calculation. You are watching the forgotten currency. If what you're hearing right now is giving you a clearer picture of how this war is actually being fought, not just on the battlefield, but in trade ledgers, intelligence files, and sanctions lists, then hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because the West's response to what China has done is just getting started. Inside NATO, the intelligence has created 3 distinct schools of thought about how to respond. Each one represents a different kind of power, and each one is more dangerous for China than the last. The first option is surgical sanctions. Name the specific companies, freeze their assets, cut them off from US dollar transactions. This is the approach the Treasury Department has already begun. It is targeted, defensible under international law, and sends an unmistakable message to every other Chinese manufacturer that the West is watching, that it has the evidence, and that it is prepared to act. The 14 entities designated in February are the warning shot. The next wave will be larger, significantly larger. The second option is systemic financial pressure, threatening the Chinese banks that process these transactions with exclusion from the SWIFT international payments network. SWIFT exclusion is the economic equivalent of a siege. Iranian banks cut off from SWIFT in 2012 watched Iran's oil exports collapse by 60% within a year. Russia's own partial SWIFT exclusion in 2022 sent the ruble into freefall within days. Chinese banks process transactions on a scale that dwarfs both of those economies. The threat alone, credibly delivered, would likely be enough to force Beijing to shut down the supply channels without a single additional sanction being formally applied. But the third option is the one that worries Beijing most, because it does not involve sanctions at all. It involves the truth. Specifically, making that truth as loud, as public, and as inescapable as possible for every government in the global south that China has been cultivating as an alternative to the Western-led international order. For years, China has positioned itself as the voice of the developing world, a counter to Western hegemony, a reliable partner that does not attach political conditions to its investments and its diplomacy. Dozens of countries across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia have been carefully balancing their relationships with China against pressure from the West. They have been able to maintain that balance partly because China's support for Russia has been deniable, plausibly neutral. Hard to prove. It is not hard to prove anymore. And as that proof becomes public, it forces every fence-sitting government to make a calculation it has been avoiding for 4 years. Do you want to be a partner of a country that armed a military that has killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, flattened entire cities, and targeted hospitals and schools? Not by accident, but by documented, systematic design? That is an uncomfortable question to answer, and China has nobody to blame for the fact that it is now being asked except itself. What China's involvement reveals about Russia is, in some ways, more alarming than what it reveals about China. Because a nation that was supposed to be a military superpower A permanent member of the UN Security Council, the inheritor of the Soviet arsenal, a country with over 6,000 nuclear warheads, has spent 4 years proving that it cannot fight a modern war without foreign microchips, foreign chemicals, foreign soldiers, and foreign drones. Read that sentence again. Russia cannot build drone guidance systems at scale without Chinese MEMS chips. Russia cannot sustain its artillery campaign without Chinese propellant chemicals. Russia cannot maintain its defense industrial base without Chinese machine tools. And those are just the Chinese dependencies. Add North Korean infantry, Iranian drone designs, and Belarusian logistics corridors, and what you get is not a superpower prosecuting a war. What you get is a hollowed-out state propped up by a coalition of partners that each have their own reasons for not wanting Russia to collapse, but none of whom actually want Russia to win. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Russia's defense budget for 2026 has been set at approximately 5 trillion rubles, around $150 billion at current exchange rates, representing nearly 40% of total government spending. Russia is spending nearly half of everything its government collects to sustain a war it is slowly losing. The social cost of that choice is already visible. Infrastructure spending has been slashed. Healthcare budgets are being cut. Regional governments are receiving less federal support than at any point since the 1990s. None of this is sustainable. All of it is a direct consequence of a war that was supposed to last 3 days. Russia's arms exports have fallen 64% in 5 years. Its former customers, India, Egypt, Algeria, Vietnam, are buying elsewhere because 4 years of Ukraine have served as the world's most expensive and most public product review of Russian military equipment. When a $400 Ukrainian FPV drone destroys a $3 million Russian tank on video that gets watched by every defense procurement official on the planet, that is not just a tactical loss. That is a marketing catastrophe that takes decades to recover from. And Russia does not have decades. It does not even have years. Its manpower losses, estimated by Western intelligence at between 800,000 and 900,000 soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or permanently disabled, represent a demographic wound that no amount of Chinese microchips can heal. China can supply components. It cannot supply the men that Russia is burning through at a rate that has no precedent in modern warfare. And here is the irony that will define Vladimir Putin's legacy for as long as history bothers to record it. He launched his invasion of Ukraine to push NATO back from Russia's borders. NATO now has 2 new members, Finland and Sweden, adding over 1,300 kilometers of new border with Russia to the alliance's perimeter. He invaded to destroy Ukraine's military capacity. Ukraine now fields one of the most battle-tested, drone-capable asymmetric warfare forces on the planet, one that has been adopted as a model by NATO members, Gulf states, and Indo-Pacific nations scrambling to prepare for their own potential conflicts. He invaded to demonstrate Russian power. He has demonstrated Russian dependence on North Korean soldiers, on Iranian drone blueprints, and on Chinese components that a room full of Western analysts spent 2 years methodically cataloging from the wreckage of Russian weapons on Ukrainian soil. And China, the partner Putin spent years elevating as the cornerstone of a new Western alternative world order, is now watching its carefully constructed facade of neutrality come apart because of a $17 $5 billion side deal with a client state that is losing every microchip that left a Chinese factory bound for a Russian drone assembly line, every drum of propellant chemical, every machine tool loaded into a container ship at a Chinese port, all of it tracked, all of it documented, all of it now sitting in the intelligence files of 32 NATO member states and counting. Putin wanted a divided West and a compliant China. He got a unified alliance, a furious set of trading partners, and a paper trail that stretches from Beijing to the battlefields of Ukraine. He built the trap himself. He just did not realize he was standing in it. If you want to understand how fast Russia's position is deteriorating on every front, from the battlefield to the oil terminals it can no longer protect, check out our video on Ukraine's devastating campaign against Russia's energy infrastructure. And if this video gave you a clearer picture of the war behind the war, make sure you are subscribed to The Military Show. We will see you in the next one.